Well, greetings and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is another episode of Karl's Spirits, and I have a question for you right off the top. What happens when the American dream turns dark? Find out tonight on episode 82 of Karl's Spirits. So, it's time for a little story. Okay, I lied. It's time for a long story. So settle back with a nice pour of something that you really enjoy. And we're going to talk about George Remus Single Barrel Straight Bourbon Whiskey. That's a George Remus Straight Bourbon Single Barrel American Whiskey. So where do we start? Well, we got to start with George Remus. George Remus is a German, or was a German-born immigrant. So he came from Germany, came to America. He moved around throughout the upper Midwest before settling in Chicago with his family. And he grew up working for an uncle as an apothecary, what we today would call a pharmacist. And at the tender age of 19, George Remus graduates from the Chicago College of Pharmacy. And within just a year or two, he had purchased his uncle's business, and then he began to expand, buying up other pharmacies in the Chicago area. This is a young man on the track to success in Chicago in the pharmaceutical world. So that's his first incarnation, if you will. Now, despite that self-made success, Remus wanted something more. He wanted something bigger for himself. So within 3 years, he becomes a licensed Illinois lawyer. And then things got very interesting for Remus. He became a well-known and highly sought-out defense attorney. Yes, he defended criminals and crooks. Now you have to remember, this is the early 1900s in Chicago. So this is even pre-Al Capone. This is kind of almost a Wild West atmosphere going on. And he has not the lack of business. He is constantly working to defend a lot of the criminals of that Chicagoland area. He even pioneered in 1914 the transitory insanity plea. And this was in a case in 1914. He proposed that his client suffered from transitory insanity. And he was successful. His client got off. Okay? So this is the first real case using a temporary insanity plea. So George Remus comes up with the temporary insanity plea, if you will. So by 1920, George Remus is making the equivalent of $6.5 million a year. So it's modern day equivalent of $6.5 million a year. The man is rolling in the dough as an attorney in the Chicago area. Also, about 1920, Remus looks around and he notices that all of a sudden, many of his, shall we say, unsavory clients are suddenly flushed with a lot of cold, hard cash. So he begins to dig. Where's all this cash coming from? And he realizes, these guys are all running bootleg whiskey. These guys are bootleggers. They are supplying the rich during Prohibition with illegal alcohol, illegal booze to the public. And if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for George Remus. That money was simply too tempting. So using his skills both as a lawyer and as a pharmacist, Remus found a hole in the Volstead Act. Now, not to get too bogged down here, but Prohibition is a federal amendment. There has to be an actual act that puts that into law, and that's called the Volstead Act. So this is what gives Prohibition its force, if you will. And he found a loophole in that Prohibition Act. And he found that medicinal spirits were still legal. And so he went into the medicinal spirits business and began buying up distilleries and their ready supply of bourbon stock. And he found that he could sell those. But wait, he also insured his product. And so when it was being transported from one warehouse to another, he would have a crew working for him that would hijack the shipment. So now he owns the booze. He's hijacking his own booze, collecting the insurance money, and he's selling the hijacked booze for a major profit to the rich of the Chicago and the Cincinnati land area. So this guy is beginning to make a mint, okay? So he is, within 3 years, actually making the equivalent of about $40 million, and he has 3,000 people on his payroll. He is the bootlegging king, as they proudly trumpet on the Remus website. He enjoyed giving lavish parties, giving back to the community. Orphans would come and play on the lawn of his big mansion, and called the Marble Palace in local Cincinnati terms. And some people even say that he was the inspiration for F. Scott Fitzgerald's Gatsby character in the novel of the same name, The Great Gatsby. That's never been proven, but some say he's one of maybe several people who helped inspire that character. What we do know is that in 1922, only 2 years in, he and his wife gave a lavish New Year's Eve party where they invited 100 couples of Cincinnati's leading families to come to his party. And as they were leaving, Remus gave every man, so 50 guys, a diamond stick pin for their lapel, and he gave every woman, every wife, a brand new Pontiac automobile. So he's Oprah way before Oprah ever thought about being Oprah. He's given away that car for everybody, okay? Now, Remus is living large, and you all know what happens. There's got to be a crash a-coming, and it happened in 1925 for George Remus. 1925, Remus is arrested on 3,000 counts of bootlegging, and after a 2-hour deliberation by a jury, he is found guilty, and he is sentenced to 2 years in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. He goes to Atlanta, he's serving his 2 years, and here's where things turn even worse for George. I guess the man's lonely, and while he's in prison, he begins to confide in another inmate, a guy by the name of Franklin Dodge, that his wife, Imogene, still had all of his wealth, and she controlled it back in Cincinnati. Now, unknown to Remus, this is where it gets interesting, guys. Dodge is an undercover FBI prohibition agent. He had been sent in undercover to get just such information out of people like Remus. There were other people being held in Atlanta in the same situation. But wait, here's where it gets really interesting. Rather than tell the government where all of Remus's wealth was being hid, Dodge resigns from the FBI and goes and introduces himself to the lonely Mrs. Remus. So now Remus's wife, Imogene, and Franklin Dodge, this crooked FBI agent, are in a torrid affair. And they even put out a contract on Remus's life in jail. Now, the guy they contracted with for $15,000 refused to take part in it because he was afraid Remus would get him and kill him. So he backed out of that agreement, even told Remus what the agreement was. So they took Remus for everything. Imogene, Remus left George with $100. Think about it. He went from making millions to $100. By this point, Imogene Remus is ready to file for divorce and run away forever with Franklin Dodge, and George is released. And he does what any self-respecting man in his position would do. He runs his wife down in a cab while she's on her way to the courthouse to file for a divorce, and he shoots and kills her on the spot. He defends himself in court using his own plea of temporary insanity. He's found not guilty. But he has to spend 7 months in an insane asylum, because if he was suffering from temporary insanity, he's got to be treated for that, right? At least that's what the jury and the judge thought. So that's the story of George Remus, and wow, what a story. He's been popularized in several different ways. Ken Burns' documentary called Prohibition really highlighted George Remus a great deal. In fact, his lines in first-person accounts were read by the well-regarded actor Paul Giamatti. The second season of Boardwalk Empire on HBO showed a George Remus. And of course, Remus Bourbon also commemorates the king of the bootleggers. Again, that's a company appellation there. Now, this Remus Bourbon is the house brand of MGP, Midwest Grain Products. It's in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. They had purchased the brand name back in 2016 so they could sell their own spirits as a house brand, so to speak. MGP, of course, contract distills and ages for a number, some say up to about 50 different labels. And so this is the George Remus Straight Bourbon Whiskey Single Barrel. And it is a high rye blend of bourbon whiskeys aged over 4 years. So this particular bottle, first of all, is a barrel pick. So this comes from a local place. We'll talk about that here in a moment. And there are actually 2 mash bills available from MGP for a single barrel pick of George Remus. In their single barrel program, they offer a low rye recipe of 75% corn, 21% rye, 4% malted barley. They also offer a high rye of 60 corn, 36 rye, and 4 barley. I personally suspect this is the low rye recipe, but I could be wrong. I couldn't get any confirmation on what this actually is. And there's no information on the label about which one it is. It is over 4 years old, but there is no age statement on the bottle. It does come in at 112.3 proof, so not crazy high, but it is enough to really set up and get your attention. This is a really nice dark orange color. I'm not even going to call it amber. It's a more orangish look. It's got really thick, sticky lines. And so really, we've talked about all of this. What does this taste like? Well, first of all, on the nose, it's got a beautiful nose of thick caramel, dark chocolate, and a hint, just a hint now, of cinnamon. It's almost like grandma's in the kitchen at Christmas baking, and you have a little chocolate, you got a lot of caramels going on, and you got a hint of cinnamon somewhere in the pantry. That's what's coming out of this glass. Okay, on the taste, it is still thick, very creamy mouthfeel. Notes of big vanilla and caramel, brown sugar. It's really interesting. If you hold it on your palate, that chocolate really pops up, which is a really nice surprise. I really enjoy that chocolate flavor. The finish is long and lingering. Lots of oak, cinnamon spice, and that chocolate note is still there on the finish, and that's really hard to beat. So, my takeaway. Wow. I'm still getting finish off that, and that's been, what, 10 or 15 seconds now? Maybe 20? Here's a great example of a great bourbon story now. A great bourbon story and a great bourbon, quite frankly. Okay, so we have the great bourbon story and a great bourbon. This one is really enjoyable, and I really regret not buying this previously. As I said earlier, this is actually a store pick from a local place. This is from Cask in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. They call this their Willy Wonka Chocolate Factory bottle. Here on the back label, they have their little sticky label of Willy Wonka Chocolate Factory barrel pick from Cask in Cape Girardeau. Now, maybe I'm too suggestible, and that's where I get those chocolate notes, but I really think the chocolate delivers in this particular bottle. I've always kind of felt MGP products to be good, but I've never felt one to be perfectly great. This is beginning to fill that for me. So because of that, I'm going to give that 4.5, that's 4.5 Karl stars. This is a product that you should have on your shelf. If you're local and you can go to Cask and they're not out of this, I highly recommend you purchasing it. If they are, hunt down another barrel pick. Yes, it's going to be a little bit different, but I really think that the hunt will be worth it in the end when you get to the taste of these single barrel George Remus. I really think you'll enjoy it. That's my take. Take it for what it's worth. And ladies and gentlemen, as always, I want you to stay safe, peace, and happy pours. And I'm going to enjoy this chocolatey caramel goodness that is George Remus Barrel Pick. Enjoy.